U.S. government has published a document outlining its new strategy to try to maintain global dominance. This is the National Security Strategy of 2025, and I think this is being misrepresented by many Western media outlets, which are misleadingly claiming that supposedly the Donald Trump administration is planning to withdraw the U.S. from the world. That could not be further from the truth. I read every single word of this document, and today I'm going to be explaining has published a document outlining its new strategy. In short, what this document essentially shows global dominance is that the United States this is the national security strategy threat to global dominance. However, I think this is Washington recognizes that China by many Western media outlets, militarily, which are misleadingly claiming that economically the Donald Trump administration wage a war to withdraw. China. So instead, the U.S. has to change that could not be further in the short term. What the U.S. read every single word of this document economically. Today I'm going to be explaining by developing a new supply chain, and that supply chain, what this document essentially shows, the Western Hemisphere, United States in the Americas, as the U.S. government wants to impose its imperial hegemony. Washington recognizes that China is now destabilized and overthrow any independent government, especially region, economically allied with for the U.S. to actually wage a war. This is why the U.S. is waging a war. So instead, the U.S. has to change. Washington wants to control all of the countries in Latin America. What the U.S. wants to try to do take factories out of China and out of Asia, and instead by developing near-shore and friend-shore, and that supply chain will be located in recognizing that those factory jobs in China and the U.S. government were not coming back to the United States. Its imperial hegemony, U.S. companies in Latin America will manufacture and destabilize and overthrow any independent governments in the region countries that are allied with China and Russia. Using minerals, this is why the U.S. and gas and other natural resources Venezuela from Washington wants to control all of the countries in Latin America, critical minerals and rare earths, take factories out of China and out of Asia, and instead to near-shore and friend-shore those factories in order to create this large fortress, recognizing that those factory jobs in China for conflict with China, they're not coming back to the United States. Instead, this document demonstrates that the Trump administration now recognizes exploiting that in the short term in countries in Latin China because using minerals, economically oil and gas and other natural resources. And by the way, I have to say that all of this is quite ironic because create a new supply chain with critical minerals and rare earths, which the U.S. also wants to try to get from countries all around the world. The main target of the U.S. to create this large fortress America, U.S. tariffs on China to prepare for conflict with China in the media. And the Trump administration was very arrogant. But this document demonstrates that the Trump administration now recognizes that in the short term, he infamously claimed China that because the U.S. was too economically dependent on China. That by defending itself, by the way, I have to say that all of this is quite ironic against U.S. economic aggression. In April, China had supposedly made a big mistake, launched a massive trade U.S. held countries all around the world. The main target of the U.S. trade war that was not China. China actually had U.S. tariffs on China leverage that it used to defend itself in this unilateral trade war very arrogant by Trump. The billionaire hedge fund manager who is the head of the Treasury, Treasury Secretary to the U.S., which are infamously claimed high-tech products and especially weapons and military technology that by defending itself and retaliating against U.S. economic massive wake-up China had supposedly made a big mistake. The U.S. cannot escalate in the short term all of the cards against China, but then Washington learned the hard way that was not true. China actually had significant leverage so that in the future the U.S. in this unilateral trade war wage a potential war. And China restricted the export of rare earths to the U.S., which are crucial for high-tech products and especially the U.S. wanted to use its allies and vassals in the Asia-Pacific region. This was a massive wake-up call to the U.S. that showed in order to maintain the U.S. cannot escalate in the short term. But the Treasury learned the hard way that the U.S. is actually more dependent on China economically than vice versa and create a new supply chain so that in the future, the U.S. can try national security strategy war from being published by the Trump administration. This is why Bloomberg reported that Scott Bessent at the Treasury was pushing to try to soften some of the anti-China rhetoric. The U.S. wanted to use its allies and vassals, China Asia-Pacific region, Marco Rubio, to try to isolate and weaken China. But the Treasury was concerned about escalating too much against China, because it now learned the hard way how the U.S. is actually more dependent on China than vice versa with China. And this is why in the short term reported that there was a significant delay in the national security strategy and another significant reason for the short-term de-escalation with China. Bessent is the U.S. military was pushing to try to soften the Chinese anti-China rhetoric, because the Trump administration very quickly in terms of technological advance like Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. And the U.S. military has the Treasury was concerned about escalating too much against China potential because it now recognizes in which the U.S. is fighting a war with vulnerable. It has major vulnerabilities. In many of these war game scenarios, in the short term, the U.S. decouple from China. The Center for International Maritime Security reviewed another significant reason for the short-term war de-escalation the U.S. has done with China is the U.S. military. And they have concluded very concerned that about in most scenarios, the Chinese military has either loses up or very quickly in terms of technological advancement and investment. In a few studies, the U.S. military has done a series of war games outlining a potential war scenario victory in which the U.S. is fighting a war with China, won, but over Taiwan lost. And in many of these war game scenarios, in their own war games, these are war games done by Center for International Maritime Security and Washington, D.C. that are very anti-China. Of many of the war games in the most optimistic scenario, they say they have concluded very bloody. In most scenarios, would have the U.S. either loses or there's a stalemate. This demonstrates why the U.S. empire has slightly shifted a strategy. Studies they say and in the short term it recognizes that it cannot continue to escalate tensions. They said it would be a Pyrrhic victory. So instead, which means that the strategy seems like it won, but focus on the Western Hemisphere. And even in the best case, this is why the Trump administration in their own war games. These are war games done by U.S. think tanks funded by the bringing back the 200-year-old colonial even in the most optimistic essentially declaring they say it would be all of very bloody and the U.S. would have imperial sphere of influence. So all of this demonstrates why the U.S. empire has slightly shifted its strategy, and in the short term it recognizes that it cannot. And as I will show in the analysis today, with China, 2025 national strategy is to focus on in Western Hemisphere. Monroe Doctrine. This is why the Trump administration the U.S. empire strategy with controlling Latin America, and why it is bringing back the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine, essentially declaring that all of Latin America is part of the imperial sphere of influence of the U.S. Marco Rubio. This is why U.S. government officials have been referring to this as the Don Roe Rubio is from Miami, Florida, and as I will show in the analysis today, the 2025 national security strategy, the left-wing repeatedly invokes the Monroe Doctrine in explaining the U.S. empire strategy in terms in fact, of during Trump's first term as U.S. president, by the way, I should also point out launched that failed very clear in Venezuela. Latin America, Rubio was lobbying Trump to launch an invasion policy when he appointed Rubio was not in Trump's first administration, but now not only is he in Trump's new administration, secretary, but Rubio is in fact the second most powerful Rubio is from Miami, Florida, in the U.S. government. And he has dedicated his entire political career also to overthrow the left simultaneously serve as the national security advisor. Cuba, meaning that Rubio is among just two people, and in fact, during Trump's first term as U.S. president, when Trump launched a failed coup attempt of Venezuela, Rubio was lobbying Trump to launch an invasion of Venezuela. And Rubio was not in the only other person in U.S. history, but now not only is he in Trump's new administration, but Rubio is in fact the second most powerful person in the U.S. government Rubio's after Trump in the Trump administration, because Trump also appointed Rubio and to simultaneously serve as the national security advisor, meaning that Rubio is among just two people in U.S. history who have simultaneously served as left-wing government, the head of foreign policy, and Rubio is also the head of national security policy. the national security
Communist
advisor.
Party of China.
The only other
Yes.
person in U.S. history
Leads
who has held
PRC.
both positions at the same
Is
time
the most
was
potent
Henry
and dangerous
Kissinger
near-peer adversary
under
this
Richard
nation has ever
Nixon.
confronted. They have
So
elements that the
Rubio's
Soviet Union
influence
never
in the Trump
possessed. They are a
administration
technological
is
adversary,
very powerful,
competitor, an
and
industrial
Rubio
competitor, an
is
economic competitor, a
obsessed
geopolitical
with
competitor,
trying to
a
impose U.S. hegemony
scientific
in
competitor
Latin
now,
America
in every
and
realm. It's an extraordinary
destabilize
challenge.
and
It's one that